Hello and welcome to So Much for Pathos, the show that acts as designated driver to its drunken friend Hollywood and tries to stop him from falling into a great big bin full of bums. I'm, of course, your detective. Last time we met, we were talking about Following. When Following first premiered at the 1998 Toronto International Film Festival, film critics were very impressed with the film's narrative complexity and efficiency, given that it was made on a £6,000 budget. Even though the movie didn't win any awards at that festival, it picked up some accolades elsewhere, winning the Tiger Award at the Rotterdam International Film Festival, as well as the Best First Feature prize at the San Francisco International Film Festival. With a decently regarded debut work, many independent film studios were looking to work with Christopher Nolan on his second feature. And here we arrive at Memento. Case notes, please. In July of 1996, Christopher Nolan and his brother Jonathan were driving cross-country from Chicago to Los Angeles, where John had originally pitched the idea as a short story, which would eventually be published in March 2001 as Memento Mori in Esquire magazine. In John's original story, we're introduced to Earl, a man with retrograde amnesia, a rare psychological condition where the patient has a great difficulty forming new memories. Earl is a patient in a mental institution after his wife was killed by an anonymous man, and the story becomes about Earl trying to escape from the institution to find out who killed his wife, leaving himself notes and reminders for things that allayed him in his escape and investigation. Christopher Nolan loved the idea and started developing his own screenplay whilst John worked on the story. When the screenplay was finished, halfway through the production of Following, Emma Thomas pitched the screenplay to Newmarket Films executive Aaron Ryder, who claimed it was the most innovative screenplay he'd ever read, due to Chris's choice of telling the story through a split narrative arc. Shortly after Following saw its release date, Christopher Nolan began working on pre-production for Memento, with Newmarket Films funding the movie at a $4.5 million budget. With prep only lasting 7 weeks and named actors such as Brad Pitt, Aaron Eckhart, Mary McCormack and Dennis Leary attached in various roles at some point, the eventual cast boiled down to Guy Pearce, Carrie-Anne Moss and Joe Pantoliano, the latter two of which had just come off of shooting The Matrix, which would have been generating hype roughly around the same time that the Memento screenplay was being optioned. Filming wrapped in October of 1999 and saw its film festival premiere at the Venice International Film Festival of the year 2000, where it received rave critical reception and went on to become a surprise box office success, with Newmarket taking a bold risk distributing the movie itself after not being able to secure a distributor in North America, which in turn gives me very strong reason to believe that this movie doing as well as it did was probably a major driving impetus for Newmarket taking a chance on Richard Kelly's debut Donnie Darko the subsequent year. Memento these days is fondly remembered as a cult classic, appearing in many top 100 lists over the years, as well as the 2011 Blu-ray re-release, and many fans of the movie continue to make arguments for and decipher the meaning of the movie ever since its initial release. So here's my opportunity to throw my hat into the ring as we investigate Memento. A minute ago I was saying how people have been discussing and trying to make sense of this movie for years now, and those who haven't seen it, I'm about to explain what I mean. Memento's narrative is divided into two sections. There are the colour sequences, which take place in present day and are presented in reverse chronological order, and interspersed between those are black and white flashbacks of our protagonist on the phone in his hotel room. Here, the non-linearity is being used in the same way as Following, to put you in the mindset of the central character. Except it's that, but taken to its logical extreme. Our hero, Leonard, has anterograde amnesia and can't make new memories. In other words, much like we need to talk about Kevin, I'm going to have to ask those who haven't seen it to go off and do so, and hopefully I'll see you in a couple of hours so we can discuss. So whilst those people are away, I'm going to recount the plot in chronological order for those who have already seen it. Lenny wakes up in his hotel room and has 2 phone calls, possibly with a police officer, in which he explains Sammy Jankis, a man with a similar condition, his injury, his quest to find his wife's killer, his notes and the idea of conditioning. He's given the clue that John G is a drug dealer, but hangs up when he finds a tattoo reading "Never answer the phone." Agitated, he refuses to answer future calls until an envelope is pushed under his door reading "Take my call" and containing a photo of Lenny pointing to his chest and smiling. He takes the call and talks about Sammy accidentally killing his wife before the cop points him towards a drug dealer called Jimmy. He meets the police officer Teddy in the lobby of the hotel room and is directed towards an abandoned building where Jimmy will be going. He meets Jimmy, kills him and snaps a photo. And now we move into colour. As Lenny stashes the body in the basement, Teddy arrives and Lenny, suspicious about Jimmy, rows with him. Teddy claims Lenny's wife survived the assault and that Lenny has worked his accidental killing of her into the Sammy Jankis story rather than face the knowledge. He goes on to claim that they killed the real John G over a year ago, but it never stuck, so he gave Lenny new people to hunt. Angry, Lenny takes Teddy's keys, burns the photos of Jimmy's body and him smiling, and writes Teddy's licence plate in as a clue. He then drives off in Jimmy's car. Lenny gets the new clue tattooed on and meets Teddy, who wants him him to leave town, which Lenny disregards. He then finds a note from a woman named Natalie in Jimmy's pocket. He then heads to her bar and they talk. She's not met him before, but Jimmy mentioned him. She thinks that Jimmy met with Teddy and takes Lenny home to stay on her couch. Natalie says that a man named Dodd is after Jimmy's drug money and thinks that Natalie took it. She wants Lenny to kill Dodd, but instead the two of them fight. She announces that she'll lose Lenny to dispose of Dodd and leaves. After waiting long enough for him to forget, she comes back in and claims that Dodd beat her up following Lenny's instructions. Lenny's then convinced and leaves to pay Dodd a visit. He then finds Teddy sitting in his car, who warns Lenny to ignore Natalie, which Lenny again disregards. He books in again at the hotel and hires an escort to reenact the night of his wife's assault. It doesn't help, and he then drives off to an abandoned area where he burns some of his wife's effects. Whilst driving away, he's then intercepted by Dodd, who recognises Jimmy's car and chases him through a trailer park. He gets away and waits for Dodd in Dodd's motel bathroom. He ambushes and beats Dodd, calls Teddy, and they run Dodd out of town. Lenny then goes back to Natalie's house. She acts supportive and they make love. In the morning, she agrees to track down the licence plate Lenny has. Teddy then intercepts Lenny outside and buys him lunch. Lenny goes back to the motel and then rushes to meet Natalie, who gives him Teddy's details from the licence plate number. This causes Lenny to identify Teddy as John G and plan to kill him. He leads Teddy to the abandoned building and shoots him dead. The end. Have you got all that? Good, because I'm not fucking repeating myself. In terms of movies that directly derive from the new wave that play with cinematic narrative whilst trying to keep the audience engaged in the story, Memento is probably on the far end of what most normal audience members are willing to allow. The editing and story structure of the film is deliberately alienating, necessarily or unnecessarily depending on your point of view, overcomplicating a straightforward story that should otherwise be easy to tell. The reason why this is hard to describe is because it's an accumulative effect that gradually builds towards the climax. You feel like it's going somewhere, but you can never be quite sure what to, and the movie fills itself with enough of a sense of doubt that you can never be too confident that the scenes in the order that they're shown have any correlation to the previous scenes. This is the part that strikes me as the most risk-taking aspect of the production. Christopher Nolan is using a very deliberate audience-alienating technique in order to reinforce the central idea. Okay, so this next part's going to sound like a no-duh moment, but when watching a detective movie, the audience takes the position of the detective, evaluating every moment of a scene for clues whilst remembering what happened in the previous scene and making predictions as to what's going to happen in the following scenes. But because the central character has a memory issue, the audience needs to consider the movie as a whole rather than a collection of individual scenes. If the audience sticks to traditional methods of deciphering information, then you're going to get trapped. The movie is deliberately designed to put you in the mindset of someone who can't remember, so what will happen is you'll be paying very close attention to one of the many scenes where Guy Pearce is investigating, and then it'll cut away to a black and white sequence which runs long enough for you to forget, and then you'll whip back in a reverse chronological order scene in which you know is meant to be connected to something. And this happens all throughout the movie. Literally, about an hour in, you'll have totally forgotten where you are and what's supposed to have happened over the duration of the movie. But like I said, this is the intended purpose. Which is why when people like the great internet critic Rob Egger, whom I greatly admire, describe Memento's narrative as being gimmicky, I'm afraid I have to respectfully disagree. First things first, as a primer on what Christopher Nolan has presented us with, let me pose a question to you. What is the difference between story and plot? Don't worry if you can't answer, I'm about to explain. You see, as we discussed last time, the French New Wave filmmakers took it upon themselves to experiment with visual language in cinema, using innovative techniques for the time, such as breaking the fourth wall, timeline jumps, complex metaphors, and so on. Essentially, the goal was to see how far they could experiment with film as a storytelling medium whilst keeping the audience as willing participants. Now here comes the part about story and plot. I'm going to try and keep my definitions as accurate as possible, but the way that I understand it is that a story would be a sequential account of events as described if they were playing out in real time, whereas a plot would be how those events are presented to the audience, as in both order of events as they occur, relevance to the story, importance of information, and so on. So story and plot essentially go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. What the New Wave filmmakers often tapped into was the idea that story and plot could be viewed as bitter rivals in order to create discussion about the events that take place across the narrative. An excellent modern example would be something like Fight Club, in which the story is about one man's personal rebellion against modern society's ideal of what manhood is and his failure to live up to that near impossible standard by forming an underground boxing club with his new best friend Tyler Durden based on the philosophy of self-destruction as a form of redefinition. The plot, however, tells the story from the perspective of someone with a disturbed and/or fractured mindset, forcing the audience to look closer and think harder about what's actually going on. Memento is the exact same thing, or at least Nolan is making it with the same school of thought in mind. The specific layout of the story is as follows. Imagine a timeline of events going from point A to point C, and then divide the timeline into two sections, creating a point B. Then rearrange C in reverse chronological order, and then place it evenly between sections of A, resulting in a story that climaxes in the middle. I hope you got all of that, because I'll be fucked trying to repeat myself. Again. Essentially, in Memento, the narrative informs the character. The jumbled timeframe is a quick and well thought out way to plug you, the viewer, directly into the central character's headspace. And it isn't entirely random either. Looking at the way the narrative is conceived, it doesn't feel arbitrarily designed to flick backwards and forwards to confuse the viewer. It appears to have been meticulously crafted to give the audience an authentic experience, so there is indeed some method to the madness. In a way, you could see it as a much more extreme version of what Nolan was trying to achieve in Following. According to many medical psychologists, Memento is one of the more realistic portrayals of amnesia ever put to film, and it really shows. goes. Leonard, because he's continually forgetting about what happened to him, goes into every scene without the concept of what happened chronologically earlier and has to figure out things as he goes along. Because the majority of the story is told through reverse chronology, we as the audience have to do the same detective work as the protagonist at the start of any given scene, attempting to infer what's going on through the evidence Leonard and we ourselves are presented with, leading to great moments like this.
Okay, so what am I doing? Oh, I'm chasing this guy. No, he's chasing me.
Each scene in the reverse sequence also reinforces the other, as the events of a scene will provide a context for the subsequent events which we have already seen and explain things which we and Leonard found confusing or meaningless at the time. For example, this...
On the house.
Thanks.
Oh, you really do have a problem.
Only makes sense when you see the preceding events later in the film. Nice. Essentially what Memento boils down to is an exploration of memory and doubt in equal measure. As well as figuring out the content of the narrative whilst trying to get us to understand the plight of the central character, Christopher Nolan is asking us to think about the themes but as presented through the prism of the scenario he's given us here. So, let's talk about it. The most prominent theme in Memento, right down to the name, is the importance of memory in defining one's own identity. Yeah, we're going to have to talk about existentialism again, people, or not for the last time. This film is far from the first to use the distorted or damaged memory as a starting point to explore how our memories shape who we are. Hell, in Total Recall, the protagonist and the antagonist turn out to be the same person. But Memento is unusual in that it doesn't give the main character straightforward amnesia.
My brother and I, when we first talked about the idea, he made it very clear to me that the reason he was excited about the idea, and I totally shared this, is that it's not amnesia. It's a form of amnesia, but it's different from what we think of as amnesia. And his point was that in an amnesia movie, there are no rules. Anything can be true. I mean, absolutely anything can be true. You know, the protagonist can be anything. He can be, you know, the killer, he can be this, he can be, you know, with no rhyme or reason. It's too easy in a sense. There have been some good amnesia thrillers, but it is a little bit easy.
Instead, Lenny can't form lasting new memories, at least not conscious ones, and so we explore how memory links who we are now with the people we used to be, and how it provides us with a sense of time and consequence. Let's start with the former, linking past and present identities. I'm not the person I was, let's say, 10-year-old me. He, 10-year-old Matt, is a part of who I am, but my abilities, knowledge, character and obviously experience have evolved over the years. Having an intact memory, I look back on the time between then and now and see a continuum of different versions of me leading up to now, providing me with a coherent sense of identity even though I'm constantly changing. Suppose I had suffered the same head injury as Leonard at age 10, so I had no clear memory of the past decade or so of my life. I would still have changed physically, hormonally and mentally. I would still have been shaped by my experiences in terms of my skills and instincts and habits, even if I have no conscious declarative memory of the process. But waking up in the morning with only my first 10 years of memory, looking round at a room I didn't recognise, I wouldn't know who I am. I would know that I am Matt Crowley, but I don't know what that now means. I would know the boy, but not what he turned into. This creates a problem in terms of Lenny's identity. He sees himself as the insurance man who survived an assault, but that's not who he is now. In the however long time he's been chasing his wife's attacker, he has changed. He's not that Leonard anymore. But because he can't recall enough for long enough to coherently analyse his new condition, it's impossible for him to know who he really is, or what he's become.
You don't know who you are.
I'm Leonard Shelby. I'm from San Francisco.
That's who you were. That's not what you become.
You see, Lenny has changed. We first see this in his conditioning. He's trained himself to subconsciously jump into certain patterns of behaviour. Most benignly, he habitually makes notes and takes photographs, and in a similar fashion habitually checks familiar pockets for notes he left himself for earlier. More troublingly, his intent and motivation have been programmed into him. He is monomaniacally fixed on finding John G. He doesn't wake up every morning and go, oh no, someone killed my wife, what should I do, where am I? He wakes up, looks down at his creepy tattoos and goes, John G killed my wife, gotta hunt him down, let's go check my pockets to see what's going on. He's also very quick to acts of violence, which suggests a gulf between the insurance investigator he was and the obsessive vigilante he's become. Because this fixation has been etched into him by repetition, it's unclear whether he could actually ever stop hunting John G. In a way, it's a kind of self-brainwashing. Mixing it up a bit. In fact, by the end of the film it's strongly suggested that Lenny actually killed John G a long time ago, but he couldn't be convinced and continued his search, killing any John G he could be tricked into thinking was his wife's attacker. And once you realise this, the movie then becomes about watching a man do literal battle with his own self-denial. Seeing as there's one side of Lenny that's driven to capture and kill his wife's elusive murderer and hopefully achieve full closure, and the other side of Lenny who would rather forget about the specific details of how she died, which may or may not have something to do with Lenny possibly being her killer. In many a great tragedy, the flawed hero is, at the crisis point, confronted with his flaw, who he truly is. This can lead to violence, suicide, or sometimes great and moving acts of repentance or redemption, depending on what the story is meant to communicate. In Oedipus Rex, for example, our hero, Oedipus, learning of his accidental, muzzle fizzling, chooses not to kill himself like his wife has done, but instead blinds himself and voluntarily goes into exile, shouldering the guilt and punishment attached to his crime and so freeing his home city of the plague his incest had brought down upon it. That's because that story is about, among other things, discovering the truth, and so it fits that the conclusion is about facing up to the truth about yourself and accepting the consequences. King Oedipus, a detective character himself, discovers that he is the cause of the plague that he's been trying to end, and so in a heroic conclusion lays down his pride and self-preservation for the sake of his hometown. In Memento, an existentialist study, the protagonist is faced with, appropriately, an existential crisis. At the end of the film, which chronologically is midway through the events of the movie, Teddy, having tricked Lenny into killing the drug dealer Jimmy, proceeds to shatter Leonard's perception of who he is and what he's been doing.
He knew about Sammy! Why would I tell him about fucking Sammy?
You tell everybody about Sammy. Everybody will listen. Remember Sammy Jacobs? Remember Sammy Jacobs? Great story, gets better every time you tell it. So you lie to yourself to be happy. There's nothing wrong with that. We all do it. Who cares if there's a few little details you'd rather not remember?
Throughout the film, Lenny repeatedly recalls a man named Sammy Jankis, who suffered a similar injury to Lenny's and ended up accidentally killing his own wife when she allowed him to mess up her insulin injections in an attempt to jumpstart his memory or test if he was faking. According to Teddy, who, granted, is himself a liar and a manipulator, Leonard's wife survived the assault, but was later killed inadvertently by him. Supposedly, Lenny subconsciously transferred this information into his memory of the case of Sammy Jankis, who Teddy insists had no wife. Teddy also informs Lenny that not only did John G not actually kill his wife, they actually killed John G together previously, and that Lenny has simply been unable to accept it. He shows Lenny a photo of him looking happy by way of evidence. Lenny is now faced with a choice: believe Teddy, whose argument is pretty solid, and try and do something about what he's become, accepting this terrible new self-knowledge, or taking advantage of his own disability, ensuring that he forgets.
Do I lie to myself to be happy? In your case, Teddy. Yes, I will.
From an existentialist standpoint, the heroic choice would be to embrace the truth and self-awareness at all costs, and in the minute or two before you forget again, take what responsibility you can for the essence of who you are. Writing a note like this, for example. Instead, he corrupts his own system of clues and mementos, title drop, by writing the note "Don't believe his lies" on the photo of Teddy and darkly putting in Teddy's license plate number as a clue for John G's identity, effectively setting him up to kill Teddy later on in what is actually the first scene of the film. Trust me, watch it, it makes so much more sense than you'd expect. Not only does this scene represent his refusal to face up to who he is and take action to change it, but it demonstrates the unreliability of every part of Lenny's identity. Lenny himself, defending the reliability of his notes, remarks at one point that memory is not dependable, whereas notes are solid and unchanging.
You can't trust a man's life to your little notes and pictures.
Why not?
Because your notes could be unreliable.
Memory's unreliable.
Ah, please.
No, really. Memory's not perfect. It's not even that good. Ask the police. Eyewitness testimony is unreliable. The cops don't catch a killer by sitting around remembering stuff.
Right.
They collect facts.
That's not what I'm saying.
They make notes and they draw conclusions. Facts, not memories. That's how you investigate. I know. It's what I used to do. Look, memory can change the shape of a room. It can change the color of a car. And memories can be distorted. They're just an interpretation. They're not a record. And they're irrelevant if you have the facts.
However, his actions presuppose that both his memories up to the assault and the notes and documentation he's made since are trustworthy. The final scene casts doubt on both these assumptions. Lenny may be remembering a murder that never actually happened. Lenny may have already found the guilty party. The notes he made himself cannot be trusted because we see he's willing to lie to himself to be happy, even if it means setting himself up to murder his only friend. It's likely that he's tampered with his record before. Pages are missing from the police report he has from the assault. By the end, we realise Lenny cannot know who he is because he cannot know to what extent any of his memories, be they in the form of notes or in his head, are real.
What the fuck is wrong with you?
Well, I guess I can only make you remember the things you want to be true.
As well as helping define identity, memory provides a sense of time and a sense of consequence, and in Memento we see an absence of both in Lenny's character. One of the most memorable scenes in the film is where he's talking to himself aloud while sleeping with Natalie. He wonders aloud how he can heal if he cannot feel time. Because he cannot remember events since the assault, he's perpetually marred in the aftermath of his loss. He cannot move on because to him it will always be as if it just happened. Every morning to him is the morning after his wife's death because he cannot remember the days in between. And as a result, he cannot ever complete the grieving process and heal. He's trapped in the worst moment imaginable for the rest of his life. That Lenny also lacks a real sense of consequence is more implied than stated, but is pretty obvious when you think about it. He cannot perceive the consequences of his actions because he cannot remember them. He cannot modify his behaviour on his past decisions unless he has a record of them in his notes. It is possible, based on Teddy's version of events, that he's been treading and retreading the same path of pursuit, manipulation and murder for years now, never stopping because he cannot remember that he's already taken revenge. It's like if you had no memory but wrote a note on your arm saying brush teeth. You brush your teeth, but 5 minutes later you've forgotten that you did so, see the note again and brush your teeth again. Then you forgot again, see the note, and so you brush your teeth again, and then again. And it goes on and on for hours until you realise that your toothbrush is bare, your gums are a bloody mess, and all your teeth are floating in the sink and you have absolutely no idea why. You actually get the impression by the end of the film that Lenny no longer cares about the true consequences of his actions so much as he does retaining what is now his only reason for living.
I have to believe in a world outside my own mind. I have to believe that my actions still have meaning, even if I can't remember them.
He knows he'll not be able to remember and therefore be able to regret any of his actions, and so he's willing to subvert his own note system in order to keep himself in a cycle of investigation and violence which he's grown comfortable in, and which provides a sense of purpose to his shattered existence. He ultimately lacks the courage to face the possibility that this sense of purpose may be illusory, that his hunt is over and his actions are in fact futile and void of real meaning, and so he writes notes which keep him on the path he prefers rather than the honest search for the truth. Essentially, Memento works as a sly retreading of following themes of identity and doubt, but is able to elaborate further whilst creating an intelligent story overall. While some may be perturbed by its narrative structure and slow burn approach to pacing, it still manages to serve up an interesting challenge for the audience, and that's all you can really ask for in a story with an unreliable narrator. Guy Pearce has a greatly well-judged bit of casting, and it's a toss-up between this movie and LA Confidential for his career best performance. Speaking personally, of course. All in all, as an overall piece about memory and trust, it exceeds expectations as well as solidifying Christopher Nolan as a filmmaker to be watched. I'm not entirely sure what it would have been like at the time, but if following hadn't proven it to critics, Memento certainly shows that Nolan is almost certainly the real deal and is ready to take on the world. Or just, Batman. Memento is a thoroughly well-crafted thriller and comes enthusiastically recommended from me. The only problem I have per se is that most people who have seen this movie are more interested in deciphering the narrative structure rather than talking about the themes implicit in the material. And I can't be too sure as to whether or not this is failure of communication on the part of the filmmaker, but either way we hope this review has started a dialogue on these themes leading to the conversation Nolan might perhaps be wanting to have. It's just a thought. Anyway, when you join us next time we'll be talking about insomnia, so the case remains open once again. I'm Matt Crowley, and that was Memento.